Well, hello and welcome to this week's A Photographic Life and the continuation of the conversation between myself and Bill Shapiro, and where we take a subject and we just run with it. In previous episode, we spoke very much about photographic education from the perspective of learning, from the student's perspective. This week, we take a different look at the same subject. This time, we're looking at it from the perspective of the teacher, and particularly the photographer who wants to be a teacher or mentor. Anyway, if you want to find out about Bill or I, look in the show notes. In the meantime, let's get on with the conversation, shall we? Okay, so Bill, welcome to the conversation. I know you've been on your travels for the last couple of weeks.
Yes, I've been running around like a maniac, and it's good to be home. It was good to be there, but it's good to be home.
Where have you been?
I was in France for an Esquire story, and then I went to Berlin with my wife to explore. I hadn't been there since 1986 when the wall was still up, and that city is absolutely crackling with great energy and visual art, and I just loved it.
What did you see? Did you see anything in particular that caught your eye?
Fantastic street art. Like everywhere you turn, there's great street art. Tyler Mitchell's exhibit just opened at CO Berlin or Berlin CO, and there was just lots of little galleries that were open and humming, and there's a real sort of embracing of the arts and of artists in that city, which you could feel just walking down the streets.
Did you find a difference between the kind of European take on that and the US take?
Well, one thing that stood out was, we were kind of walking back to the neighborhood where we were staying, and there were performance pieces being done on the street. But there was not a hat out. Nobody was looking for money or donations. They were just making this art and expressing, these feelings because they wanted to. And you don't see that very often in the U.S. Everybody's always, got their hand out.
Last time we were talking about that idea of learning photography, learning the medium. And I think we kind of ended up very much seeing it from the kind of student learning perspective. And I think the conversation needs to include the perspective of the teacher as well, because I think a lot of the photographers who will be listening to this podcast and who we know will have considered the idea of teaching. But I think before we start, what I'd like to do is kind of, I suppose, in a way, sort of dispel the myth that teaching means standing at the front of a class in front of rows of seats and talking at people or presenting prepared lectures, or as it used to be in the old days, in a dark room with a slideshow. I think today the idea of teaching is far more, or should be far more, based on conversation. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think people learn differently in different kind of environments, but and I also think that depending on the cost of things, and I know there's different models in England than in the United States, but as I've told you, I work with quote unquote students or just photographers who want to, learn or accept a different perspective, interested in different perspective all the time. We do it over Zoom, and, it's quite, they seem to feel like it's quite helpful. So I couldn't agree with you more that it's about a conversation at the right time sometimes that can sort of crack open a whole new perspective.
But I think one of the kind of issues, I suppose, and I do come from conventional sense of education as well as a mentorship, is that a lot of photographers seem to feel as if that teaching means that they need to offload or download years and years of experience in one kind of a big lump. But I think you and I both know that the reality of being a successful teacher is actually more about listening than it is about talking.
Wait, what'd you say? No, I'm kidding. No, no, I think that's quite right. And I think, in a teaching environment, not only the student has to have their ears perked up and ready and engaged, but the teacher does too. And I think listening for the teacher, a teacher needs to listen closely to what's being said by the student, but also to what's not being said, or what's not being asked. And I think sometimes thinking about those things that are going unsaid can be as important as to answering the direct questions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I often think that actually a photography teacher is as much a psychiatrist as anything else.
Well, for sure. I would agree with that. There's a lot. Well, I mean, there's a few things we can talk about here. We can talk about teaching quote unquote skills, how to do this, how to do that, how to take a picture of these two things at this time of day, or use lights like this. But there's also teaching about an outlook, teaching about self-confidence, teaching about how to approach other people, softer skills that I think often do not sort of get expressed or get learned in a classroom setting. Your classes seem to be different from most of those I've heard about. But I mean, I think some of those soft skills that are so important to making a living in photography and enjoying yourself often don't hit the classroom.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I've probably used the term transferable skills more than anything else when talking about photography. And I think that there is perhaps, I don't know if it's an old school thing, but I do come across a lot of people who feel that teaching photography needs to be teaching the subject the way in which they learnt it. But they may have learnt it 10, 20, 30 years ago. And as we know, photography is constantly evolving.
Well, photography is evolving, but and so is the culture, obviously, and the work culture. Someone who used to shoot celebrities 30 years ago, for example, might not have tons to teach someone shooting celebrities today, because 30 years ago you might get 2 weeks with a subject, and today you might get 10 minutes. And so it's a very, there might be some small ways that they overlap, but it can be a very different skill and a very different experience.
But that constant reference to the idea of Sontag or Barthes and all of that kind of stuff, for me, feels very outdated today.
I, could not agree more. Which is not to say that people shouldn't try to read Sontag. Like, I think they should, if only to tell themselves that, this really has no bearing on me, and it's impenetrable, and it's, at least from my perspective, for people who like to bloviate about photography. But it's important that you know what she wrote and how she wrote as a data point, even so you can move away from it.
Yeah, I completely agree. But so what do you think that people should be reading about or teaching? How do you think people should be teaching the medium today?
Well, can we back up for 1 second? I want to talk about what you just asked, but you used the term transferable skills a moment ago. And maybe you could explain to me what exactly you mean by that. Like, what skills are transferable?
I think they're life skills. I mean, increasingly, I find myself in a position whereby I don't feel that as a photography teacher, I'm actually teaching very much photography. I feel as if I'm really sort of teaching around confidence, the importance of popular culture, the importance of relevance, of finding stories. I suppose in a way, I find myself talking more about journalism than I do photography.
That's interesting. So like, what aspects of journalism, like you're talking about finding a story, cultivating a source, that kind of a thing?
Yeah, meeting people you find who are interesting, engaging in conversation, research. And I think as a teacher, you need to kind of encourage those things and encourage the personal, rather than thinking, well, I've spent 10, 20, 30 years, whatever, doing this thing, and therefore I'm the expert, and I'm going to tell you, because in reality, you may well be an expert, but within quite a narrow field.
Yeah. And also, going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is the culture changes. And so if you're not listening to your student saying, this is what's going on in the culture, this is why I'm having a hard time doing X or Y, this is what my challenges are today, you're not really helping them. Because things are so different today than they were, 15, 20 years ago. So I think the listening and the being very aware that things have changed, and to be asking your students lots of questions as opposed to just sharing your wisdom, is really key, I think, to being a good teacher.
Also, I think staying relevant.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
I mean, you were just talking there about Tyler Mitchell in Berlin and seeing exhibitions. And we've now started this new thread on the podcast with Fiona Hayes, Seesaw, where we're trying to kind of, I suppose, bring what's happening in photography today to people to ensure that they're remaining up to date, because I still see so much teaching which is kind of referencing the past, which is great. I mean, I have no problem with history, but at the same time, we've got to put things into a contemporary context, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard to put things, I think, into a context without knowing some history. But if all you know is history and you're not seeing what rules are being broken today, I do think it's a problem. And I think, I want to skip. I know I'm skipping around a little bit, but it's early morning here in New Mexico. In talking about what you were just saying about journalism, and that you speak sort of more about journalism and how to find a story and whatnot, I think that's such a great point, because I see so many younger photographers basically using themselves as their subject, exploring identity, some kind of self-portrait work. And I think that that's important, to learn how to express yourself and to learn how to, excavate some of those feelings. But it's also really important to look out, to look away, to look around the corner and over the hill into other communities and other kinds of people, because I'm not sure how much you learn when yourself is the only or primary subject that you focus on.
But I think that's also a problem. When I was just saying there about that knowledge of popular culture and of what's going on around you, I think that we've become, I was talking to a photographer recently about this, and they were talking about the Taylor Swift-deization, if that's a word, where we're constantly or people are looking inward for creative impetus. Whereas I think that a good teacher should be able to open new worlds. I always say to students when I'm giving open day talks, as I was recently, encouraging students to come to university, I always say that you're coming to university to learn about things that you don't know exist. And I think that in photography is a really key factor. We really shouldn't just be saying, yeah, look at Cartier-Bresson, look at this, or, names they may have heard of. We've really got to be there to say, yeah, but what about this?
And so I guess the question is, how do you find the this? How do you find the new stuff? And you're talking about staying current and exhibitions. And I think you were starting to ask, what should people be looking at? What should people be reading? You and I, maybe it was 2 or 3 episodes ago, asked, a dozen photographers and people in the photo world about what they read in terms of magazines for photography or in lieu of magazines. And we came up with a pretty varied list. And I think, maybe you can link to that in the show notes again. But I think the point, the big takeaway there is, What's interesting now is that not everybody is reading the same 6 magazines for inspiration. They are finding inspiration far and wide in places you wouldn't necessarily think to look. And so, it's kind of thrilling that there's so much going on out there. The burden is on you that there are not newsstands really anymore. You have to go and look at it, but it's only as far away as your laptop, really.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, before this podcast, I was having lunch with a few friends from the publishing industry and at my home. And it was funny because they started to name all these magazines, and every magazine they named had closed. And I sort of thought, this is your world. You should really know that these magazines don't exist anymore. So
right.
Why do you think it is that people come to you? What do you feel that you're bringing to your mentorship teaching? Let's kind of make teaching and mentorship one thing. What do you think you're able to give?
I think, well, first of all, I think an outside perspective. Sometimes students are working in such a focused way on their own work that they can really benefit from a disinterested party. Interested in wanting to help them grow and learn, but I'm not attached to the work. So there's that off the bat. I think they're coming to me because I'm someone who has seen a ton of different work and maybe can make connections or references that they don't know about. Me personally, I'm fairly good at expressing my opinions, but more to the point, I think what I'm good at is helping photographers sometimes express things or realize things that they don't even see in their own work that exists, but they don't know. Recently, I was working with a photographer who years ago had experienced sort of a deep trauma, and this is decades ago, and didn't sort of realize that his relationship to trauma was being expressed in the stories that he chose to photograph. He thought he was just shooting exciting stories, but the people in his stories were also victims as well. And so that was a big connection for him because it let him breathe out and say, oh, I am working on something to do with my identity, but I'm doing that because I'm looking outward. And so that was just a connection that he hadn't made. And so I think, and I'm not just saying I'm alone in doing this, I think an outside person can really help a photographer make those kinds of connections.
It's really interesting you say that. Just going off at a tangent, but I met up with the photographer Elle Tatler recently, and we were having a bit of a chat. And he gave me a copy of his book, I Need to Live, and I was reading through it. And I've known Jürgen and of his work since the mid-1980s, really. And it was only in reading this book that I realized how much of his work comes from trauma. And it instantly made me think I'd really like now to kind of sit down and continue that conversation. And I suppose in a way, in a kind of mentorship, not that he needs it, because I think he recognizes that. But that is a really interesting area, isn't it? How many photographers are actually kind of living through a past trauma through their work?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a trauma or it could be some other psychological spin cycle that they went through. But I think, one thing you're not going to get most often in a photography class with rows of students, you may not be able to have that connection be made. You'll be able to learn about a lot of great photographs or techniques, but it's the personal sort of exorcism of what may be inside you that I think can come out when the quote unquote teacher is really listening.
So that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the challenge for the teacher, is to actually identify that they're there, as I said earlier, to listen, but really to kind of find out themselves. I think the teacher should be on that sense of journey as much as the student should be.
Well, that's what's really exciting for me when I do these sessions, whether they're an hour or whether they're more extended. It is a little bit like therapy because I do want to find out what they're going for and also maybe what's holding them back from from getting into a different market? Is it fear based on something, or is it just a lack of confidence, or is it a lack of skill? And I can't really help a photographer because I'm not technically based, and I've never been a photographer proper. So I don't know anything about lights. I don't know much about settings, but that stuff can be learned. I think it's the more, and I hate to use this term, but therapeutic or relationship, the experiential conversation that I think someone like me, who's there to listen and reflect, can help with.
But I think that's a good teacher. You see, I think that's the point at which I remember when I first started teaching, which was 15 years ago. I really thought, I've got all this experience, all this knowledge. I'm going to share it with people. And I very quickly realized they weren't really that interested in what I knew. And in fact, I had a couple of students who kind of came to talks I gave after they'd graduated. And I sort of said to them, well, why are you here? And they said, well, because when you said it before, we didn't believe you. But now we realize that we need to hear what you've got to say. So there is a point at which the teacher really has to identify the level at which the student, the person learning, the mentoree is at. There's no point talking above their head.
And above their head is one thing. And there's something else as you were talking that came to me, which is some photographers come to me and they're really good at making fantastic single images. Those images are beautiful. Maybe they're thought provoking, but they're not a story, or they're not a narrative. And so, one thing I can do is help them make those photos have a trajectory of sorts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I can help them to say, okay, you've got a beginning and you've got an end. What are we doing in the middle? And, they may not, for whatever reason, have, think like that. And that may be youth, it may be the way their brain works, doesn't matter, maybe their experience. But to have somebody say, if you want to make this a book, for example, or a zine, or just a great slideshow, it can't be the same thing 26 times. You do need some kind of a curve, a story curve. You need to change the rhythm, just as people like you and I who have looked at many, many, many pages of photo essays, we know there's a way to tell a story. And I think that's something that we can help photographers with.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have I do, so I'm slightly leading the witness here because you may or may not, but do you have a set sort of series of questions or instigations which you ask the student when you first meet them or at the beginning of that kind of relationship? I'm going to answer that yes and no. Here's what I do. When somebody wants to engage with me, I say, great. A week before we're to meet, send me 20, 25 images, your choice, whatever you want to talk about, and send me 5 questions you want to talk about. So my question is to them, you send me the questions you want to talk about. And that leads them to really focus on what they want to get out of this, as opposed to just having somebody like me talk about their work, which I think is lazy. I want them to really key in on what's important to them. And from those questions, that will drive our conversation. But it may also be, hey, how come you didn't ask me about this or that? Do you not care about marketing, or you don't know about marketing and you really need to know about marketing? So I let their questions guide and lack of questions guide our conversation, if that makes sense. It does, because in the world of academia, it would be called flip learning. Okay,
I learn something every day.
So the idea behind that is really to try and encourage the person who is the student to take control, take responsibility for their own learning. And I think that's a really key factor for any photographer thinking about teaching, to understand that they've got if they perceive there to be a kind of a power kind of relationship there, whereby They're the experienced one. They're the one with all the knowledge, and the other person, the student, is going to come and kind of benefit from that. They really need to reassess that, because it should never be a kind of a power control relationship.
Well, and also, to your earlier point, if I don't get a sense of where they're coming from and where they are and what they know and what they don't know, it does very little good for me just to spout off a lot of names of old dead photographers. Like, it might help a little bit, but if I don't know where they're coming from, I don't think I can be of tremendous use to them in the moment.
So what if a student comes to you and says, I don't know any photographers, I don't really know any of this, and I'm kind of like, that's where I am. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I guess it depends on what they're asking of me. Like, do they have these 25 photos, and are they just asking for feedback on the pictures? And if that's the case, I might say, oh, you know what? You're shooting cars in a really interesting way, but you may want to go look at Langdon Clay, who did this great series of color photographs of old cars in New York City in the 70s. And so his work is about cars, but it's also about setting. And in a weird way, it's also about himself as a young man at night, coming home from work at midnight or later in a scary city, and what he sees. And, and I might give a couple other references like that and say, look at those references, come back to me in a week or two. Tell me what you feel when you look at them. And let's talk about how an idea like that, a broader context, can improve your images or your perspective on your own images.
So in a sense, the photography teacher's a door opener.
Yeah. Doors, windows, I would never say make your photographs like this, but I might say, see what this guy's doing? He's able to broaden the story that he's telling. So it's not just beautiful photographs of beautiful cars, but there's another layer there. What layer, student, do you want to express, or what layer do you feel coming out? And let's talk about how we can include that in your very pretty pictures.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key, isn't it? Is once again, you're flipping it, you're putting it back to the photographer and saying, well, why are you doing this? If you want my time, you've kind of got to put some of your own time into the learning. But, I think a lot of photographers who like the idea of becoming a photographic teacher can become quite frustrated quite quickly when they realize just quite how demanding that is when the student is looking to them for the answer.
Like, I guess I don't feel that I can give answers if a real question hasn't been asked of me. I mean, I can spout a lot of stuff, but I have no idea if that's actually answering anything that's worthwhile, which is why I do, I think you used the word therapy earlier. And I do feel like it's a therapy session, not necessarily like I'm trying to help them work through something on an emotional level or psychological level, but trying to really identify what may be holding them back in terms of their soft skills, in terms of their knowledge of the industry, or in terms of their pictures. And, a lot of photographers come to me and again, they make very good photos, tell very good stories, but they have no idea how to market their work because they haven't been in, say, the media world. Maybe they came up through fine art. So they have this great sort of book or story they want to tell, but they don't even know the first thing about how to get that story out there and get photo editors to look at it. So fortunately, I do come from that world and I can help them with a skill like that.
But I think you're also helping them with a lot more, because I think that it's very easy in a sense for both of us to kind of look at it from that perspective. But I think actually, and I go back to that word journalist again, as a journalist, you're very good at forcing people to ask questions of themselves. And I think good teaching is kind of encouraging the person to understand the why, but also to go out and find questions and then answer them themselves.
Yeah. I think that's such a great way for people to think about it, that they will go into a learning experience, into a relationship with the teacher, and being prepared really to ask questions both of the teacher but of themselves too.
Which is interesting for this particular episode because you've been traveling and haven't had the time to do all your usual homework. And actually, you're asking and I'm asking questions of ourselves. And I think we're kind of coming up with answers.
Well, I would leave that to the listeners to decide, but maybe. I want to mention one other thing I do in my sessions with people, which is I record them. And I send them transcripts because I don't want them taking notes really during the session. I want us to be having this is over Zoom 99% of the time. I want us to be engaged in this conversation and not take pauses for them to take notes and miss things. So I always send them the transcript afterwards or the video of our call. And so many people tell me that they have gone back over those notes, the transcript, months later, because sometimes something it doesn't strike them in the moment, but strikes them some months later because of something that came up, and that can be very useful. So, this is advice for a student more than a teacher, which I know is not what we're talking about. But if you are in a class, I would definitely ask your professor if you can record that session.
It's interesting because I think it is good advice for a teacher, actually, Bill, because I have a rule in all of my lectures that nobody is ever allowed to open up a laptop. Nobody is allowed to type whilst I'm speaking, but we have old-fashioned A3 notebooks for them to scribble in as scruffily as possible, just to make notes that they could respond to. But also, I encourage all of my students, if they wish, to leave their phones at the front of the class so that they can record the audio of the lecture.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very similar thing that we're trying to get engagement. I don't want to turn students into typists.
There's something else too from the teacher's perspective. I was recently asked to speak to a college class, a college photo history class, which I did, and it was and it was over Zoom. And I would say that 85 to 90% of the students had their laptops open and were typing in their laptops. And as the teacher, I had no idea if they were taking notes or if they were on Facebook or writing another paper. And it was really distancing from the perspective of the teacher. I found it very hard to connect with students who aren't making eye contact and may or may not be engaged. So I love the idea of putting the laptop down.
Yeah, well, I also have a rule that on Zoom, all students have to have their cameras on. They have to be sitting at desks. They have to be dressed for a lecture. And I always refer to it as the virtual classroom to ensure that we get that kind of connection that's going on. And I've had lecturers, I've said, well, how can you possibly do that? I said, well, we just say you've got to do it. And they do it. And we do get 100% attendance at all of our lectures because they recognize the importance of that feedback. So there is a role, I think, for the teacher, the photography teacher, to actually take control of the situation.
Yeah, for the benefit of the students, for sure. I wonder if you think it's worth us talking about, we've talked about some things that we think teachers could do and could include. You have much more experience in this than I do, but should we talk about some mistakes that you see teachers making?
Yeah, sure.
What do you got?
I think that I'm going to talk from the perspective of, I think, teaching photography can fall into two areas. One is the kind of institutionalized academic photographer who has taught within a formal situation for many, many years, hasn't worked within photography for that time. The other is the photographer who has worked in industry and then comes into tuition and seems to think it's easy. Of course, to think it's easy is to disrespect all the training that a teacher would do in any other subject rather than just, photography. So I think there's two specific areas. And from my personal perspective, what I see is a lot of academic teachers just kind of teaching the same thing and it becoming kind of stale because their reference points are no longer relevant to what's going on. And then the photographer coming in and teaching, and as I say, thinking it's all about them when it really isn't, and not being aware that if you do teach in a formal situation, you really are part of a team and you'll have different aspects of the course delivering different aspects of the medium. And therefore, you can't just try and teach everything you know in one go because you might be treading on the toes of somebody else. And I've seen that quite a lot. I've also seen photographers coming in and teaching without fully recognizing the importance of understanding the module guide that they've got to teach from. And the students are pretty astute at spotting that and then calling the lecturers out. So I think you have to be really careful from whichever perspective to ensure that you still enjoy what you're doing and you understand exactly what your role is.
Yeah, as you were talking, I've been thinking a little bit about some lectures I've attended. So it's not exactly, 6 months in a classroom kind of thing, but they're more one-offs. And the photographers have largely talked about themselves. They've talked about their work. They've talked about themselves. And there's a terrific place for that because some of these guys have amazing stories and amazing insights. But it's kind of more, I have found, entertaining than illuminating in terms of how will that help us, another photographer, do something like I would urge people to listen to some of Ralph Gibson's lectures or talks because he has great stories and he has great insights. And there's very few people around today who have assisted, Dorothea Lange. Ralph Gibson did, and he took a great lesson from her. But I think there's a lot of photographers who will yammer on about themselves. And it's interesting in an entertaining way, but not necessarily in a super helpful way.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I could spend every lecture I give talking about all the mad and crazy things I've done in my career. But to be honest with you, that would just be self-indulgent and wouldn't actually be me doing the thing I need to do. Listen, Bill.
I think if there's a story, and you've told me some stories about mad and crazy things that happened, but you tie a lesson to it, which is do your homework. Okay, so I can't remember which celebrity singer, and you almost glued their mouth shut or something. I can't remember some mishap with glue because you hadn't really done the research as a younger photographer about what happens to that glue after 10 minutes. I'm kind of making that up, but the point is,
it was Kylie Minogue, and it was glue fumes.
Okay, glue fumes. The point is, and the point you made was do your homework before you get to the set. Know how all the ingredients will interact. Know how tall or how short this person is, and if they will fit in the box that you have constructed, and on and on and on. And so if there's a lesson that comes from it and a takeaway, then I'm all into it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I must one day tell you about the shoot with Demi Moore when Sheryl Crow wandered in. That's a good one to tell you. But listen, Bill, it's been a fantastic ramble chat today. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and if you're listening and it's relevant, we're getting a lot of contact now, a lot of emails, a lot of messages from listeners, which it's really great. And I've been including them in some of the podcast episodes when it's just me on my own. So do let us know what we think, because we may have ruffled a few teaching feathers out there, but we may also, I hope, have given a little insight to those of you who are thinking that you would like to teach.
And also, I would say, in terms of feedback, if there are topics that you would like us to talk about that you think would be helpful for us to hit on, send those our way as well. Because we're not doing this for us, or at least a small, not mostly. It's fun talking to Grant, but we're doing it for you. So if there's something that you want to know more about or want to hear us jaw on, let us know.
I think that's the perfect way to end an episode on teaching. It's all about you.
Thanks, Grant, as always.
It's been a pleasure. For those listeners who know, we nearly missed this particular episode. I was enjoying myself a little bit too much, and Bill dragged me away from a bottle of white Rioja. So thank you, Bill, for doing that.
As always, happy to take you away from your fun.
I'll catch up with you next month.
Take it easy, Grant.
Of course, it was a thanks to Bill and a thanks to you also for listening. Just leaves me, as every week, to suggest that you take care.